Will they learn though, Rachel? I mean, we have a Zionist, what is it called, chokehold on U.S. politics here in the United States and in Washington. And so it seems like, the United States is not even making its own decisions anymore when it comes to the Middle East and in many places of the world. It's Israeli influence that is, targeting countries and creating the framework, I guess you could say, the architecture for a lot of these conflicts. I mean, that's just where I see things going. So unless we get a hold of this Frankenstein that we've created out of Washington, perhaps we can have some more self-reflection inside of Washington. And we can see how U.S. policies have been splintering Europe. We can look at the case study of the Ukraine war and the Nord Stream pipeline bombing, for example. Quite apart from the huge economic toll it is taking, Poland now is refusing to extradite a suspect in the Nord Stream 2 bombings to Germany for prosecution, effectively ending any hopes of justice. And other European nations are pressuring Germany to drop the case entirely. So for my final question for you, Rachel, what does that say about the state of Europe, considering this investigation is splintering the continent? Is the continent as disunited as at any other time in recent memory? What do you think?
I think they're getting to that point. I think they still have a ways to go. But yeah, it's been interesting to watch this Nord Stream investigation because it comes up every several months, I would say, right? We get some new update and then you don't hear about it for a little bit and you kind of forget about it. And then it's like, oh, yes. In this latest report, it's interesting because Germany has decided that they've got this group of Ukrainians, essentially, that they say they are responsible, right? They are the ones who are behind this very sophisticated military bombing of the Nord Stream pipeline that, it's just your average Joes, essentially. And now they're pointing the finger at Poland saying, oh, well, Poland's the reason we can't continue with this because they've got this one guy and they refuse to extradite him because they see him as a national hero. But when you take a step back, we also have to remember the reporting. And I think that the reporting by investigative journalist Seymour Hersh is probably the most spot on that I've seen in this case, pointing to the fact that, look, this was a full-on military operation. And that it was, really years in the works before it was carried out. And that this is not just a couple of Ukrainian guys on a yacht getting together, carrying out this very advanced bombing of the pipelines that were able to do it. But of course, when it initially happened, the focus was on Russia, and the West claimed over and over again that Russia bombed their own pipeline. The pipeline that they just spent billions of dollars and years building, that they just got together and bombed it instead of simply turning off the gas like you would think that they would do if they wanted to end their work with Europe. But then they had to go to the next quote unquote logical option, which in their mind was Ukraine. They're like, obviously, yeah, Ukraine, they had every reason to hate the Nord Stream pipelines, to hate the fact that it was Russia sending cheap gas to Germany. We've got to cut that off. And so then that became their next story, their next prime suspect, while keeping all eyes off of the US. And yet when you look at who has benefited from the bombings of the Nord Stream pipelines, it's the US, because now instead of buying cheap gas from Russia, Europe has to turn and buy much more expensive gas from the United States, which is exactly what they've done. And it's kind of crazy sometimes when you look at the situation in Europe and you go, they still don't get it. They still think that the US is for them. They still think that Washington is an ally that they can trust. And they are just completely oblivious to all of the ways in which the US has set them up to fail. One of the most recent is, of course, the fact that you have the Trump administration with this new scheme that, oh, we're not involved in the war in Ukraine anymore. We are outsourcing it to Europe. We are selling weapons to Europe. Europe's going to pay for them, and then they're going to transfer them over to Ukraine, basically putting it off on Europe that they are the ones directly involved in this proxy war against Russia, while the US is still providing the military intelligence sharing with Ukraine. So I don't know exactly how they expect that to work, but you look at Europe and you do see some splintering, right? You do see kind of an awareness. And I think we're starting to see a version of that. We've seen it in recent elections with the parties that are more are asking more questions about the war in Ukraine, about funding for the war in Ukraine, that they are starting to get more and more support, and that the establishment politicians in Europe are getting a bit of a wake-up call that, okay, we don't have public support fully in the way that we did back in, say, 2022, when they could just point the finger at Russia, say Russia's the bad guy, they invaded, and then everyone would throw in their votes to send as much money as possible to Ukraine. So I think we're getting to that point. I also think the US empire, while it feels like it has to be the top dog, I think that ultimately they're making a mistake by continuing to throw Europe under the bus. They don't want Europe to get too powerful. They certainly don't want an alliance between the EU and the UK and Russia, which is what they were so concerned about at the start of all of this, that they would see those quote unquote allies align with Russia and then turn against the US. But I think going back to what we were talking about when it comes to the growing multipolar world, when you have countries like Russia and China and Iran and even India to a certain extent was wanting to put aside some differences to work with China, to continue to work with Russia, when you see those allies standing together, and then you look at the US and its vassal states in Europe that are falling apart, I think that the US is going to live long enough to regret putting Europe in that position and to regret not having strong allies by being so focused on overall primacy, so focused on we have to be number one, everyone has to be below us, that they're not seeing the bigger picture and really the overall shifting on the world stage of what happens when you get multiple countries that are bigger players that go, hey, we think we can work together, and then they really start to take on the US.
Rachel Blevins, thank you so much for joining us today. It was a pleasure, and I've certainly learned a lot from you. You have a skill where you can just, share this information so eloquently and so calmly and collected. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And y'all be sure to give Mid Press News a follow and get them to 100,000 subscribers.
Thank you.